The grand marble corridors of Hampton Court echo with the heavy shuffle of silk. Sunlight bleeds through gold-trimmed curtains, glinting off jeweled goblets and embroidered robes. A king sits upon his throne, but not the one you imagine. Beneath the polished veneer of majesty, another throne awaited him daily. One made not of gold and power, but of oak and necessity. This was the royal close stool, a chair with a hole in the center, fitted with a silver or brass bowl beneath. It was as essential to a monarch's day as his crown, yet it was shrouded in silence. This was the throne where pride met humanity. And dignity often lost the battle. Centuries before the invention of the modern toilet, royal hygiene was not only primitive, but profoundly ceremonial. For ordinary peasants, the call of nature was private, a squat in the fields behind the stables or into a simple bucket. But for kings, privacy was a privilege denied. Every act, even the most personal, became part of the performance of power. To relieve oneself in solitude was to behave like a commoner. Instead, the king's bodily functions were supervised, recorded and attended to by one of the most exclusive men in the entire court, the groom of the stool. This man, despite his title sounding absurd to modern ears, was no mere servant. His duty was to prepare the royal close stool, fetch the fine linens, and yes, assist the king in cleansing himself. But more than that, he was the keeper of secrets. When the monarch sat upon this second throne, he often dropped more than just waste. He dropped the mask of power. Here, behind closed velvet curtains, he could complain about court politics, betray his fears, whisper his doubts. And the man who knelt beside him, the groom, listened. He became the monarch's most trusted companion, a confidant forged in embarrassment. During the reign of Henry VIII, the groom of the stool was one of the most envied and influential positions in England. Names like Sir Henry Norris and Sir Thomas Heneage were whispered across the court, men whose fortunes rose from this unthinkable service. Through their access to the king's most private hours, they learned things no counsellor could. The groom was often the first to hear about royal decrees, the last to know of a mistress dismissed, and sometimes the one who could change a decision before it left the chamber. It was a relationship that blurred the lines between humiliation and power. Imagine it, a monarch feared by all, conqueror of wives and nations, reduced to human frailty before one trusted man. The same hand that wiped away the king's waste could, in time, influence the fate of kingdoms. But the ritual itself was far from dignified. The process began with ceremony. Servants would prepare scented water and embroidered towels. Perfumed sachets were burned to mask the odor. The close stool was draped with fine cloth, and every movement of the monarch was treated as a matter of etiquette. The groom stood nearby awaiting signals. And though every instinct must have screamed for privacy, the king bore it with stoic pride, for his body, even in this, was an instrument of divine right. Yet, as bizarre as this sounds, it revealed a truth about power rarely spoken. The greater the ruler, the less human he was allowed to be. Every part of his life, even the most natural, became a spectacle. The king could command armies, but he could not command a moment of solitude. The irony was striking. Beneath the gilded ceilings of royal palaces, where every breath was adorned with ritual and perfume, the air carried another smell, one no amount of lavender could erase. Behind closed doors, velvet and lace brushed against the wooden frame of a stool that no monarch could truly escape. In these intimate, almost tragic moments, the myth of royal perfection cracked. For all their power, kings were reminded daily of their own frailty. They were prisoners of etiquette, trapped within garments too grand to function and traditions too sacred to break. So each morning, as courtiers bowed and choirs sang, the monarch faced a private battle, one not recorded in history books, yet more human than any war or treaty, the battle between dignity and the body, between the performance of kingship and the humbling truth of being alive. This hidden throne, this absurd theatre of necessity, was a symbol of monarchy itself, lavish, ritualistic, and detached from reality. The groom of the stool became both servant and shadow, a reminder that even the greatest men must bow before nature. And as the curtain of this secret world lifts, one can't help but ask how many royal decrees, treaties, or betrayals were whispered between the folds of linen and the sound of flushing water. How much of history, we wonder, was shaped not in council chambers, but on the royal close stool? The royal mourning began not with prayers or politics, but with layers. Dozens of them, silk, velvet, fur, brocade, a cascade of wealth stitched into suffocation. It took servants nearly an hour to dress a monarch, each fold of fabric carefully arranged to reflect divine majesty. But beneath that grandeur lay a grim truth few would ever whisper. These clothes were prisons, and within their heavy folds kings fought a silent, daily war against their own bodies. In the candle-lit chambers of Versailles, the king's dressing ritual was a performance of power. Courtiers would gather to witness the lever du roi, the rising of the king. They bowed, murmured blessings, and handed over garments in precise order. Stockings first, then padded undershirts, then breeches, waistcoats, doublets, and finally the robe, that massive symbol of authority, weighed down with gold thread, fur trim, and jewels. But once dressed, the monarch's freedom was gone. Every movement became an ordeal. To sit required assistance. To eat demanded careful posture. And when nature called, it became a logistical nightmare. You see, these robes weren't designed for convenience. They were designed for spectacle, to remind everyone that a king was not like other men. His clothing turned him into a statue of living glory, but one that could barely move. The robe was both his armor and his curse. For centuries, kings across Europe suffered this indignity. From France's Louis XIV, the Sun King, to England's George II, their daily reality was the same: sweating beneath layers of brocade, breathing the trapped air of perfume and perspiration, waiting for the moment when their royal bladder rebelled, and when it did, they had choices, none of them pleasant. In the early modern courts, the toilet as we know it did not yet exist. Instead, close stools, chamber pots, or portable commodes were hidden behind screens or curtains. For a monarch, even the act of relieving oneself was wrapped in etiquette. He could not simply excuse himself and disappear. It had to be arranged. A servant would be summoned. The groom of the stool, or in France the valet de chambre, would discreetly prepare the stool. The king, encased in silk and lace, would waddle awkwardly behind a partition, often needing 2 or 3 attendants to help lift the robes aside. The sound of rustling fabric filled the air, mingling with the faint hum of the court continuing beyond the curtain. Music, whispers, footsteps, and there, surrounded by the scent of lavender sachets and burning candles, the world's most powerful man would sit helpless, sweating under the weight of his own garments. Louis XIV's attendants wrote of his frequent discomfort. His royal robes, weighing nearly 30 kilograms, made even bending impossible. The Sun King, radiant before his court, could hardly move in private, yet appearances had to be maintained. Even in moments of physical need, the ritual remained sacred. For the attendants, these moments were both intimate and perilous. A single misplaced gesture could offend royal dignity, but the king's struggle was no less humiliating. He could conquer nations, but not his own clothing. The irony was grotesque. These lavish outfits, meant to display divine perfection, trapped their wearers in sweat and stench. Without modern plumbing, the residue of luxury lingered. Servants carried away chamber pots through gilded hallways, the faint trail of odor clinging to the drapery. Candles burned constantly to mask it. In Versailles, perfumes filled the air, not for beauty but for survival. Imagine it, 18th century France, the palace gleaming with marble and gold. Yet behind every wall, a hidden network of servants hauling human waste through corridors that smelled of roses and rot. It was the hidden heartbeat of royal life, the part no painter ever dared to capture. Even more absurdly, these struggles were seen as symbols of refinement. To suffer elegantly was a virtue. The ability to endure discomfort, whether from corsets, wigs, or robes, was proof of nobility. The body was to be conquered, restrained, silenced, and yet behind closed doors the mighty kings of Europe did not feel divine. They felt trapped, by tradition, by fabric, by expectation. Some were known to shed their garments in frustration, pacing in linen undershirts like caged lions. Others simply gave in, sweating in silence, their courtiers too afraid to notice. But while these heavy robes strangled the body, they also hid another secret. Beneath their folds thrived something far more sinister than discomfort, something alive. Lice, fleas, mites, the silent armies of royal hygiene. They feasted on powdered wigs and silk collars, hiding in seams, crawling across the necks of kings and queens who dared not scratch in public. Soon, these tiny creatures would cause a quiet revolution, one that would change royal fashion forever. But before that, the monarchs of Europe would continue to drown in luxury and sweat, prisoners to their own image. And as history turned its pages, one thing became painfully clear. The higher the crown sat upon the head, the heavier the weight of the robe, and the deeper the suffering beneath it. Beneath the shimmer of gold-threaded robes and pearl-lined collars, another kingdom thrived, one unseen, yet always hungry. Tiny, relentless, and invisible to the eye that admired the crown. While kings ruled nations, lice ruled them. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? The most powerful men in history, emperors, monarchs, conquerors, scratching in secret like peasants. But this was the hidden truth of royal luxury. No matter how much perfume or powder they wore, their bodies were crawling with life. The 17th and 18th centuries were an age of elegance and excess. Powdered wigs cascaded over silk shoulders, and faces were painted pale as marble. Yet beneath that flawless facade lay the itch of decay. Hygiene was almost non-existent. Bathing was thought dangerous, a superstition that water could open the pores of the body, letting illness seep in. So kings and courtiers avoided baths entirely, sometimes for months. Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, reportedly bathed only a handful of times in his life. His courtiers boasted of their fragrance, not their cleanliness. Instead of soap, they relied on perfumes, gallons of it. Rose water, lavender oil, orange blossom, all to mask the reality festering beneath their finery. Wigs became both fashion and disguise. They hid baldness, aging, and most importantly, the insects that plagued everyone, from the humblest servant to the royal family itself. But those same wigs, stuffed with pomade made of animal fat and scented powders, created the perfect breeding ground for lice. Behind closed doors, attendants armed with fine-toothed combs would scrape through their master's hairpieces, crushing the tiny invaders between fingernails. The air filled with the cloying mix of perfume and decay, a nauseating perfume of rotten roses. Yet in public, the royal image remained untarnished. To scratch one's head during a council meeting was unthinkable. The illusion of divine perfection had to be maintained at all costs. Even the most immaculate portraits lied. Those oil paintings of serene monarchs, gazing nobly toward the heavens, hid the truth. Just moments before posing, their attendants may have been brushing away lice from their powdered wigs or replacing soiled linen. Their calm expressions were masks, painted over discomfort and itching flesh. This infestation wasn't confined to the head. Beneath the layers of brocade and velvet, the skin itself became a battleground. The warm, airless space between fabric and flesh turned into a breeding paradise for fleas and mites. And because washing was rare, the insects multiplied endlessly. Courtiers developed strange rituals to cope. Some carried small sticks tipped with ivory, ear scratchers and back scratchers, carved with elaborate handles, so they could discreetly relieve themselves in public. Others placed dried herbs in their pockets or undergarments to ward off pests, though the insects remained indifferent to these fragrant defenses. And then came the powder, white as death. It wasn't just for beauty. Powdering the wigs and faces was believed to suffocate lice, though it mostly suffocated the wearer. The thick cloud of white dust clung to everything, the air that drapes the food. Servants wore handkerchiefs over their mouths as they doused their masters' heads, creating a ghostly haze in the royal dressing rooms. But it didn't work. The lice adapted. They always did. When a royal wig became too infested, it wasn't cleaned as it was burned. New ones were made, often from human or horsehair. The cost of appearance was staggering, yet no one dared abandon the tradition. For to appear unpowdered, unperfumed, or, heaven forbid, unwigged was to appear human. And royalty could not be human. Ironically, the more they covered themselves, the more they suffered. Beneath every powdered wig was a scalp raw from scratching. Beneath every jeweled robe was skin crawling with fleas. The perfumes that filled their palaces were not symbols of refinement. They were weapons in an endless war against their own stench. And yet, this grotesque routine became part of courtly life. It was normal, accepted, even admired. In the royal courts of Europe, suffering was the price of beauty. The physical agony of lice, the suffocating powder, the relentless heat of heavy garments, and all endured in the name of elegance. No one dared question it, because the entire system of monarchy depended on illusion. The illusion that kings were divine, untouchable, perfect, but perfection, it turns out, has a smell, and it isn't sweet. Imagine Versailles at its peak, grand halls glittering with chandeliers, musicians playing in the distance, courtiers whispering beneath frescoed ceilings, and behind it all, the constant scratching of hidden royalty, the faint patter of servants carrying away wigs to be replaced or bedding to be fumigated. It was a world built upon perfume and denial, where the scent of decay was masked by power. And yet, for all their riches, for all their crowns and jewels, the kings and queens of Europe were united by one small, humiliating truth. They itched and they could never escape it. But soon, the illusion would begin to crumble. As whispers of modern hygiene and scientific curiosity spread across Europe, this filthy secret of the aristocracy could no longer remain hidden. And with that revelation came the slow, painful end of an era, one that stank of powder, pride, and parasites. In the grand palaces of Europe, thrones were not always symbols of glory. Some were far less majestic and infinitely more human. Behind the marble columns and golden halls, another kind of throne awaited the world's most powerful monarchs, the royal toilet. It was not porcelain. It did not flush. It was, quite literally, a gilded chair with a hole in it, a seat of both dignity and humiliation. Beneath the velvet cushion sat a bowl of brass, silver, or ceramic. And though it was hidden from public sight, this necessity defined the daily routines of kings and queens far more than the historians like to admit. For a ruler encased in layers of silk, lace, and brocade, the act of relieving oneself was no simple matter. Their robes weighed more than a modern soldier's armor. To remove them entirely would require an entourage, attendants, valets, and maids, each responsible for unlacing, lifting, and holding the royal garments. But dignity demanded privacy, or at least the illusion of it. So came the invention of the close stool, the portable royal toilet. Fashioned from mahogany, lined with velvet and fitted with a removable bowl, it followed the monarch wherever they went. Courtiers even designed matching versions for travel, complete with handles and perfumed compartments to mask the smell. Some were disguised as ordinary furniture, a chair, a chest, even a prayer bench, but despite its luxury, the reality was grotesque. In the days before plumbing, these royal thrones depended entirely on human service. After the king finished his private business, a servant, sometimes a nobleman, would step forward to clean and carry away the waste. In France, this man had an official title, Groom of the Stool. The groom was no ordinary servant. In fact, it was one of the most prestigious positions at court. To be chosen meant you were trusted above all others, for who else could share such intimate proximity with a monarch? The groom dressed the king, managed his schedule, and yes, attended to his bodily functions. Some even held political influence, whispering secrets into the royal ear during these most private moments. Imagine it, a duke or earl kneeling before a gilded chair, cloth in hand, while the most powerful man in Europe sat above him in silence. The absurdity of the ritual was masked by etiquette, yet everyone knew its meaning. Even kings were prisoners of their own bodies. The Queen's situation was no better. Elizabeth Vice of England, famed for her poise and power, had her own elaborate system. Her maids of honor attended her with basins and towels, ensuring her royal modesty was never compromised. Her dresses, so tightly layered and laced, made even the simplest act a struggle. Once she was dressed in the morning, she could not undress again until nightfall, meaning she often held her bladder for hours during long councils or ceremonies. Royalty learned to endure discomfort as a matter of pride. So a grimace, a shift of weight, or a sudden departure could hint at weakness. Thus many endured excruciating pain in silence. And what of the smell? In an age when perfumes replaced hygiene, the royal privy was both a sanctuary and a source of dread. Even the best efforts to conceal the odor failed. Incense burned constantly, scented handkerchiefs were pressed to faces, and bowls of dried herbs were kept nearby. Yet the stench of humanity lingered, an unspoken reminder that even divine rulers were made of flesh and rot. Some palaces, desperate for solutions, built primitive plumbing systems. At Versailles, waste was emptied through hidden shafts and tunnels into cesspools, but those cesspools often overflowed. Visitors wrote of foul vapors drifting through the palace halls, tainting even the king's chambers. One ambassador described Versailles as a paradise for the eyes and a purgatory for the nose. In other courts, the problem was simply ignored. When the Emperor of Austria travelled, his retinue carried a gilded commode aboard the carriage, discreetly shielded by curtains. Louis XIV of France reportedly held audiences while seated on his toilet, claiming that it saved time. Servants entered to take petitions as he attended to his needs, a bizarre merging of majesty and mortality. Even centuries later, the echo of this ritual remained. The notion of the toilet throne became embedded in royal identity, an odd unspoken link between power and the body. To sit upon a throne, whether in the council chamber or the privy, was to rule over something. The irony is staggering. Kings who commanded armies, who decided the fate of nations, could not dress or relieve themselves without help. Every royal robe, every jeweled belt, every button that symbolized their grandeur, also symbolized their captivity, and yet no one questioned it. To speak of such things was taboo. The monarchy's mystique relied on silence, the belief that kings were more than men, untouched by human frailty. But within those velvet-draped chambers, the truth could not be hidden. Beneath the wigs, the silks, and the gold, they were as mortal as the peasants they ruled. Bound by their clothes, confined by ceremony, enslaved by their own image. The throne, it turned out, was never a symbol of power. It was a reminder that no matter how high one rose, nature always demanded its due, and as the centuries turned, this illusion of royal perfection would begin to crack. The Enlightenment would question everything, including the notion of godlike kings. But before the crown fell from its pedestal, one final humiliation awaited the royals, one that would expose, quite literally, the fragility of their grandeur. The 18th century was a turning point, not just for empires, but for hygiene, pride, and illusion. The glittering courts of Europe, once seen as divine centers of grace and cleanliness, began to rot from within. Behind their golden doors, the royal palaces stank, literally and morally. Versailles, that magnificent jewel of France, was the crown's greatest pride and its most pungent embarrassment. The palace had no proper toilets. Servants emptied chamber pots into hallways, courtyards, and fountains. Even visiting ambassadors complained that one could hardly walk the corridors without stepping into something foul. The stench was so unbearable that courtiers carried perfumed handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, symbols of refinement that masked a far dirtier truth. Louis XV and his courtiers pretended not to notice. Perfume became the disguise of the era, a fragrant veil over decay. But the illusion could not last forever. Beneath the lace and laughter, resentment fermented. The people outside, hungry and cold, began to whisper, if the king was divine, why did his palace reek of filth? In truth, royal hygiene had always been a paradox. The monarchs claimed purity and godliness, yet their own chambers were cesspools. Their robes were rarely washed, their wigs crawled with lice, and their toilet rituals were spectacles of both opulence and absurdity. And when the age of reason dawned, with philosophers and pamphlets spreading like wildfire, those hidden habits became symbols of corruption. By the mid-1700s, the Enlightenment had begun to dismantle the myths of monarchy. Science, reason, and sanitation were now tools of revolution. The same minds that questioned divine right also questioned royal filth. If kings are appointed by God, one pamphlet mocked, why do they stink like mortals? The ridicule cut deep. Satirical cartoons in Paris and London portrayed kings sitting on toilets, crowns slipping from their heads, their royal robes bunched up around their waists. The symbol of the toilet throne, as once hidden from view, became a weapon of mockery. For centuries, the people had believed their monarchs to be above human weakness. Now they saw them as men trapped by their own vanity, so burdened by robes and etiquette, they couldn't even relieve themselves in peace. But the truth was darker still. As revolutions brewed, the monarchies of Europe continued their rituals of waste and denial. Marie Antoinette's chambers at Versailles were said to shimmer with gold and silk. Yet beneath the floorboards, a maze of pipes carried the foulness of daily life, leaking, festering, and forgotten. The air reeked of perfume and decay. It was beauty painted over rot, a metaphor for the monarchy itself. And then came the storms of 1789. When the French Revolution erupted, the people finally invaded those gilded halls. The commoners who had once starved outside now wandered the rooms where their kings had feasted and lounged, and they found the filth. They saw the truth that centuries of etiquette had tried to hide. Reports from revolutionary witnesses describe Versailles as a palace of perfume and pestilence. Bedsheets unwashed, privies overflowing, vermin scurrying beneath golden drapes. The revolutionaries laughed bitterly. The divine royals, it turned out, could not even master the simple art of cleanliness. When Louis XIV was dragged from his palace, stripped of his silks and his servants, it was more than a political actor, it was symbolic. The king was being separated from his myth, his robe, his gilded toilet. In the stark cell of the temple prison, there was no velvet seat, no groom of the stool, no perfume to hide the odor of humanity. He was just a man again, sweating, trembling, and mortal. Across Europe, the fall of kings revealed the same truth. Power had always been an illusion stitched together by ceremony. Those magnificent robes that once elevated rulers above their people had also imprisoned them. They couldn't move freely, eat freely, or even relieve themselves without an audience. And now those robes were being torn away, literally and symbolically, by revolution. The age of cleanliness, born from the Enlightenment, was not only about soap and sanitation. It was about exposure. Dirt became political. Hygiene became moral. To be clean was to be civilized. To be filthy was to be corrupt. The irony was tragic. The people who once worshipped their kings as symbols of divine purity now saw them as the dirtiest of all. New ideals emerged. Plumbing replaced chamber pots. Privacy replaced spectacle. The toilet throne was dismantled, replaced by something far less ceremonial, but far more humane. The idea that one should handle such things alone in silence was revolutionary in itself, and yet the memory lingered, the image of kings on their secret thrones, helpless in their heavy robes. It haunted art, literature, and gossip for centuries. The revolutionaries didn't just destroy palaces, they destroyed the illusion of royal perfection. By the time the 19th century arrived, the age of powdered wigs and perfumed rot was over. Modernity had flushed away its symbols. But the ghosts of those royal privies, their golden bowls, their secret attendants, their perfumed shame, remained as cautionary relics of a world that once confused grandeur with divinity and filth with power, because in the end, history's greatest irony was simple. The closer a king came to godliness, the further he drifted from his own humanity. When the last echoes of the monarchy's grandeur faded into the smoke of revolution, their gilded toilets and perfumed secrets were thought to have died with them. But history has a way of clinging, not just to walls and paintings, but to human habits, to the quiet psychology of power and shame. What began as the royal struggle against robes and bodily needs transformed into a modern obsession: privacy, image, and control. The story of kings on their hidden thrones didn't end with their downfall. It evolved, reshaped by plumbing, progress, and pride. The invention of the modern flush toilet in the 19th century was more than a sanitary revolution. It was a cultural one. It symbolized freedom, the kind kings had never known. For the first time, humans could perform the most human act in solitude, without attendance, without judgment, without ceremony. But beneath that progress lay the same fear that haunted every royal palace, the fear of exposure. Monarchs once hid their bodily functions behind silk curtains and perfumed air. Now society built porcelain walls to do the same. We inherited not just their technology, but their psychology. The rise of the bathroom as a sacred private space was a reflection of centuries of discomfort. Even in modern palaces, this legacy persists. Queen Victoria, for example, demanded complete privacy during her morning routine, and ordered servants never to speak of her bathroom habits, an unspoken rule that continues in royal households today. It's said that even modern monarchs have custom-designed silent flush systems to ensure discretion. The thrones have changed, but the silence remains royal, and it isn't only kings and queens who inherited this obsession. The industrial age turned cleanliness into a social currency. Soap advertisements of the 19th century didn't just sell hygiene, they sold morality. Cleanliness is next to godliness, they declared, echoing the divine illusions that once justified kingship. The clean body became a sign of virtue. The unclean, a mark of moral decay. The irony, of course, is that these ideas were born from the filth of kings. The same aristocrats who perfumed their wigs to hide lice had set the stage for a global standard of cleanliness that was less about health and more about appearance. Society learned from their mistakes, but also repeated them in subtler ways. Look at the fashion world. Elaborate gowns, corsets, tuxedos, all designed for image, all restricting movement and comfort, much like those suffocating royal robes. The human desire to appear flawless, divine, and untouchable has never disappeared. It merely moved from marble palaces to modern bathrooms, from royal rituals to daily routines. Consider the 20th century, the age of glamour and cameras. Hollywood stars became the new monarchs. They too were wrapped in costumes, their flaws hidden under powder and perfection. Behind every polished interview and sparkling red carpet lay the same secret truth. We are all prisoners of presentation. The royal struggle with heavy robes became the modern struggle with self-image. And yet, technology brought us full circle. In the digital age, privacy, once the privilege of kings, has become a public performance. Social media turned the bathroom mirror into a stage. Where monarchs once hid their humanity, we now broadcast ours. Filtered, edited, perfected. Even the smallest imperfection feels scandalous. There's something deeply ironic about that. We no longer wear ermine robes or powdered wigs, but we curate our images with the same intensity kings once reserved for royal portraits. The throne has become metaphorical. Our phones, our profiles, our brands. And just like the kings of old, we fear being seen for who we really are. But history whispers a warning through the corridors of time. Every age that worshipped perfection eventually collapsed under its own vanity. The palaces of Versailles crumbled, not just from revolution but from rot, the kind that perfume could no longer hide. The lesson is as clear today as it was in the 18th century. When image becomes more sacred than truth, decay follows close behind. Modern royalty understands this well. Buckingham Palace may be equipped with the finest plumbing in the world, but its inhabitants still live within walls of ritual and restraint. The monarchy remains a performance, one that must never show sweat, struggle, or humanity. Every handshake, every public smile, every polished wave is another layer of control, another modern robe too heavy to remove. And beyond the palaces, the legacy lives on in all of us. We flush away discomfort, disguise our flaws, perfume our imperfections, as though admitting them would make us less human. The truth the kings could never face is the one we all still avoid, that dignity doesn't come from denial, but acceptance. So what remains of those royal toilet struggles? More than one might think. They remind us that even the greatest rulers were bound by the same needs as their subjects. They remind us that pride and shame often share the same seat. And they remind us that history's most powerful thrones were never golden. They were porcelain, humble and human. As the centuries turn, perhaps the real evolution isn't in the design of the toilet, but in our willingness to embrace imperfection. The heavy robes may be gone, but the burden of appearance still weighs on us all. And maybe, just maybe, the day we stop pretending to be gods and accept being human will be the day we truly ascend the only throne that matters, self-awareness. Because the true secret of kings wasn't their crowns or their power. It was their silence, the universal silence that still echoes through history every time a door quietly closes and humanity meets its most private truth.